Okay, chapter 14, the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. So the spinal cord and the associated spinal nerves are an important link between the brain and the rest of the body. Two basic important functions: pathway for sensory and motor inputs. So if you detect the stimulus, whether it's painful or pleasant, like petting your cat, there are sensory neurons that send that info into the central nervous system, in this example here being the spinal cord. So color-coded in red, that's a sensory or afferent neuron. Afferent pathway, remember A for adding info into the central nervous system. And within the central nervous system, there are interneurons that synapse with the sensory neurons, and those send sensory input up to the brain via the cursor, here we go, via the spinal cord. And then the brain processes that input, that info, and then the brain decides if any motor commands, any motor outputs required. And then those commands then go from the brain down to the spinal cord and exit at the appropriate place to innervate, and they exit via spinal nerves to innervate effectors, in this case a skeletal muscle, and that's innervated via a motor neuron color-coded in red, and then that would be the motor pathway, also called the efferent pathway, E for exit. And in this case, the innervation at a muscle fiber within a muscle will cause, in this example here, response to move away from the stimulus. It looks like attack, all right? And an effector is something that affects change, like a muscle or a gland, stuff we've talked about previously. And then reflexes, as you see here in a reflex arc, are the quickest reactions to stimuli. They're essentially survival mechanisms that we have had as animals for a very long time. Okay, overall anatomy. Your spinal cord is 14 to 18 inches long, approximately, depending on your height. If you're very short in stature, it might be less than 16 inches. If you're really tall, it might be more than 18 inches. It's about 42 to 45 centimeters. And your spinal cord runs from the base of the brain, exiting the cranium through the foramen magnum, if you remember that opening in the occipital bone. And it's continuous with the brain. And your spinal cord extends all the way down through the vertebral canal or the vertebral foramen. Remember that fairly large opening in each vertebra. So here in yellow is the spinal cord coming down through the vertebral canal or vertebral foramen of the vertebra. And it terminates at about C1 or L1. I'm sorry, it starts at C1. Cervical 1, meaning spinal nerve, cervical 1, all the way down to about L1, right about the start of the lumbar vertebrae. And the end, the tapered end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. And the reason your spinal cord ends there, even though your vertebral canal continues all the way down through the sacrum, is because developmentally, as we're growing as embryos, the central nervous system and the rest of the body systems are growing, and the spinal cord stops growing at a certain age of development, embryologic development, but the skeletal system continues to grow. So the vertebrae continue to enlarge and get longer and larger, and the spinal cord does not. So what happens is, as these lower vertebrae continue to grow, they pull the spinal nerves along with them through the vertebral canal. So inferior to level of L1 on the spinal cord, within the vertebral canal you only have spinal nerves. And then they go down and then they exit at the appropriate place, meaning their appropriate intravertebral foramen, if you remember that, all the way down to the sacrum. Okay? So let's see. The spinal cord ends right about L1, but the spinal nerves that continue inferiorly below that Looks like a horse's tail to early anatomists, I imagine, so it's called the cauda equina. Cauda, tail, equina meaning horse. So these are the spinal nerves that extend below, inferiorly from the conus medullaris, the physical end of the spinal cord. And then also, along with the cauda equina, there's something called the filum terminale, which is color-coded here in yellow. And it extends its connective tissue, thin filament, and extends all the way down to the coccyx, and it helps anchor and hold the spinal cord in place. So here's a dissection of this region of the vertebral column with the spinal cord internally. So you see this central mass is the spinal cord, and it ends right about there. So that kind of tapering cone-shaped structure is the conus medullaris. And then notice next to it, and then continuing inferior to it, are the spinal nerves, the cauda equina. And this is the connective tissue envelopments of the spinal cord that have been moved aside. We'll learn those as we go. So here there's the thin tapering conus medullaris, and then that little thin filament, that is the filum terminale that continues down to the coccyx. And then next to it, which has been pulled apart there, that is the cauda equina. Those are the spinal nerves that continue down through the vertebral column, the vertebral canal, all the way down into the sacrum. In our lab models that we'll look at, this view is kind of analogous to this. There's the more obvious tapering conus medullaris, and then right down in the middle, I can't see the number, it looks like 15 possibly, that's the filum terminale. And then what's on the sides of it, notice these are individual spinal nerves, and the exit at their appropriate sites. That entire structure there we call the cauda equina. Notice there's ribs, so then here's going to be lumbar vertebrae 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then notice that looks different, so that's part of the sacrum. And then there's the iliac crest of the hip bone, and then some of the musculature. But that's one of the lab models you'll be looking at. All right, so the spinal cord has certain areas where it's thicker or wider, and there's the cervical and lumbosacral or lumbar enlargement. So not super obvious here, but it's a little thicker. There's the cervical enlargement, cervical because it's right in the neck area. And then here's the lumbosacral, sometimes called the lumbar enlargement, the top of the lumbar area. And the reason the spinal cord is thicker here is because there's more gray matter causing the spinal cord to widen out. And the reason there's more gray matter is there's more neurons in this region and in this region, because these neurons serve the upper and lower body extremities and limbs. So there's more innervation, more wiring, more nerves. So to physically accommodate that, the spinal cord is enlarged in those two regions, the cervical and lumbosacral, or the cervical and lumbar enlargement. If you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, there is a posterior or dorsal region and an anterior or ventral region. And there's these two grooves within both. And the posterior or dorsal median, meaning in the middle, groove is called the sulcus. And then the anterior one, or ventral median groove, is bigger, and that's referred to as a fissure. So fissure is deeper than a sulcus. And when you see a cross-section of the spinal cord, the easiest visual, physical structure that allows you to determine anterior and ventral versus posterior dorsal is this bump, or swelling. And that's the dorsal root ganglion of the dorsal root, which means this other root's the ventral root. And then when they merge, as the roots move away from the spinal cord, these are spinal peripheral nervous system structures, where they merge, then that's the spinal nerve. So if you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, whether it's a picture diagram or a slide, histological slide, identify this bump and just burn that into your memory, dorsal root ganglion, which means that's a posterior or dorsal median something sulcus. Then that means on the opposite side, the deeper one is the anterior median fissure. Now in a diagram, the fissure is always so much bigger than the sulcus. In a real slide, it's hard to distinguish the two. But that's a nice landmark. Okay. By the way, that is the sensory neurons coming in. And that's where the sensory neurons nuclei are located. And the nuclei are bigger than the axon fiber, which is why there's a bump there. And then these are the pathway, ventral root, for the motor neurons. And the motor neurons' cell bodies are located in this darker structure, which is gray matter. If you remember, gray matter is darker because of unmyelinated axons and neuronal cell bodies. Another physical structure to help you determine posterior from anterior is the gray matter, which is centrally located in the spinal cord. Kind of has this weird H shape or kind of a weird butterfly shape in the center. But notice part of the gray matter goes all the way back and touches the edge of the spinal cord, and then the other side doesn't. So the posterior or dorsal gray matter goes all the way back, and that's called the dorsal horn. The anterior or ventral horn does not reach the edge of the spinal cord. That's another indication that, okay, that's posterior or dorsal, but the dorsal root ganglion, that's almost impossible to miss. So the dorsal root, sensory neuron axons or fibers. And then dorsal root ganglion, there you go, sensory neuron cell bodies. Then the ventral root, come on, here we go. Ventral root is motor neuron. They're axons, and again, their cell bodies are in the anterior gray matter. It's called the anterior gray horn. And then spinal nerves are referred to as mixed nerves. Remember, a spinal nerve is moving somewhat away from the spinal cord because contacting the spinal cord are the roots, dorsal root and ventral root. But where they merge, then there's a spinal nerve. And they're called mixed nerves, meaning that the spinal nerve contains both sensory neurons and motor neurons because they're merging together. The sensory neuron fibers go here, then the motor neuron fibers go through there, but they do merge at the spinal nerve, or spinal nerves, hence mixed nerves. Here's another picture that we've seen before, I think even last chapter. Right, there's the sensory neurons, there's their cell bodies, hence the bulge. So in real life, there's not just one, there's hundreds to thousands, so the bulge to accommodate the neurons. And then notice the motor neurons, their cell bodies are in the ventral or anterior horn of the gray matter, and then their axons or their fibers are exiting via the ventral root. And this diagram doesn't show it, but as we move away from the spinal cord laterally, dorsal and ventral roots do merge into the one spinal nerve. So again, mixed because the spinal nerves have both sensory and motor neurons. Spinal meninges. These are connective tissue layers and developments of the spinal cord. We have three of them. The brain has the same three in the same positions. So the dura mater is really strong, hence dura means strong. It's a superficial most fibrous connective tissue meningeal layer, and that's what you see here in darker blue. Really tough, strong. Deep to it, the middle, light blue, the middle layer is called the arachnoid layer. The arachnoid mater. It is the middle layer. Okay. And then deepest, here in tan, is the pia mater. It's the deepest, and it's actually clinging, adhering to the surface of the spinal cord. And then deep to that, well, then you have the naked spinal cord. And there's the roots. Notice they merge here, and there's the spinal nerve, technically. And notice that the roots, as they go towards or away from the spinal cord, they also branch themselves, and those are called the rootlets. And we'll continue this on the next lecture.